You know what the slides are. You'll keep us moving. Okay. Whoever needs a slide will hold the wave at you. Okay.
No.
Are you going to pass it?
The people who have their own slides will get to change them, but I will move from one speaker to another.
We'll see the slide there. Okay. We need to close the doors at 3, obviously, to try and keep the noise in. Give it 2 minutes. Hey, so? Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to have a side event on long-term strategies and plans. My name's Elliot Whittington. I'm Deputy Director of the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group. I'm going to introduce and chair proceedings and talk to you a little bit about our panellists. Thank you very much for joining us. So if I can talk a bit about the organisations that are involved here today. So I'm here and indeed my colleagues are here on behalf of the Corporate Leaders Group on Climate Change, which is a group of leading businesses working to engage particularly with European policymakers to further the case for climate action and the transition to a sustainable economy. And we're very happy to be collaborating with the Vasudha Foundation, which is an NGO and think tank that works on clean energy and climate policy issues in India, and the B Team, which is a non-profit which brings together a group of CEOs to lead by example and advocate a number of causes, including supporting a net zero climate goal and supporting a just transition. And you'll hear more about those organisations, I think, during the presentations today. But the topic that brings us together is one that arises naturally, I think, out of the Paris Agreement. So. And indeed, naturally, out of the commitment to address climate change. Climate change is a long-term problem. It is something that will impact our society and our ecology and our economies over the course of decades, and it is something where our actions and our responses must be structured over the course of decades. So it requires longer-term thinking, and indeed that is recognised within the Paris Agreement, where there is a specific call for long-term planning. Also, it requires us to target to structure our economy so that rather than contributing climate emissions to the atmosphere, we need to get to net zero emissions. And that's a very clear implication. So we have a number of perspectives, both from business, from policymakers and from NGOs, and also some research that we've been doing that we're going to talk to you about today. What we're going to do is have a number of short presentations just to give you a sense of what of those perspectives. And then I'll ask a couple of questions of the panel, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions from all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Natasha. Natasha Siprajaj, I've got that wrong, but I'll let you correct me, and I apologise, is the Public Policy and Government Affairs Manager for Europe for 3M, a company that prizes itself on its record and innovation. So Natasha.
Thanks, Elliot. It's Zbrizaj, but you were pretty close. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I have been asked to talk a little bit about my company and sustainability. So how 3M is approaching sustainability, what we are doing. Maybe just to start, as probably not everyone is familiar with 3M. Who is 3M? So 3M, it's a big company. You probably know us for Post-it notes, Scotch tape, and other consumer products. But actually, in principle, we are a technology company. You might be surprised, but 3M products are pretty much in everything you can imagine around you, from your car to water you're drinking, so the filtration products, to powering the grid, many other applications around us. So as a technology company, how do we approach sustainability is actually something that we were working on since a long time. Since 1975, for example, we had this 3Ps concept, so polluter pays principle concept, where we were focusing a lot on the reducing our footprint from manufacturing footprint, water management, etc. But since 2013, we took a little bit a step back and tried to look at the sustainability more broadly. So there are two things very essential for 3M, let's say, sustainability approach. It is, firstly, we always want to have a purpose. So purpose is really at the core of everything we do, basically from developing new products to reducing our own emissions to, thirdly, encouraging 3Mers, so the 3M employees, to be impactful as well. So the employees have to think sustainably as well in in daily lives and also as workers, so when trying to innovate and create new solutions. And apart from purpose, the second thing is collaboration. So of course we cannot solve all the challenges alone. So when we were developing the sustainability goals for 2025, we have been very closely in contact with our customers, with the entire supply chain, partners, stakeholders, and of course external advisors to really help us understand what are the greatest challenges that are there and which we should work on. So, what are the global challenges that 3M decided to look at for our 2025 sustainability goals? This might not surprise you because they are pretty closely linked to SDGs as well, so to the UN goals. So raw materials, definitely a big challenge existing out there. Energy and climate, that's also why we are here today at the COP23. Water, so water scarcity, a big problem in most of the parts of the world. Health and safety, and also finally education and development. So of course, taking these global challenges and transforming them into our sustainability goals, you see, I think you see pretty much all the sustainability goals we set to ourselves for 2025. Of course, all of them formed around the global challenges we identified. I will not go through all of them, but something to point out, maybe here as well, linked to what I started with. We are looking at reducing our own emissions, our own footprint, so these are all the internal goals. But what we introduced also in 2013 is how we can commit to reduce the footprint of our customers. So this is a new thing. So we pretty much embedded sustainability in all of the business strategies and all of the product development portfolios that we are having is now also taking these sustainability challenges within them. So looking at energy and climate, for example, we set to ourselves a goal that we will help our customers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 250 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions through the use of 3M products. So now I will give you one example. So, for example, when we are discussing the fight against climate change, one of the solutions we developed, and it's now also being deployed and used in a couple of pilot projects around the world, US, Europe, but also Korea, and being in discussion also in other parts, is, for example, the SF6 replacement. Some of you might know SF6. So SF6 is one of the perfluorinated greenhouse gases. You probably all know HFCs, but SF6 is actually the most potent one of all the fluorinated gases. It has a global warming potential of 23,500 CO2 equivalent, and it's actually it has the strongest increase rate today. So as 3M, we developed an alternative for the SF6 use in switchgears, and we are trying to move this forward. Of course, we still need some international action on it, also in the form of regulations and financial incentives. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And I think that's an interesting example of something that's happening more and more, which is how companies are developing their sustainability plans firmly contextualized within the context, to repeat myself, of global goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. To build on the business story, our next speaker is Michael Koch, who's the Principal Officer for Climate and Environment Management at Safaricom, a Kenyan telecommunications company which many of you may well be aware of because of their very well known, rightly so, M-Pesa mobile money scheme. Michael.
Thank you very much. So my name is Michael Koech. That's how you pronounce it. From Safaricom. So probably I will talk about Safaricom briefly because probably not most of us are familiar with the company. Safaricom is a mobile organization that operates solely in Kenya. We have about 28 million Kenyans using our service. We offer, apart from M-Pesa, which has about 20 million customers, we also offer other services like voice, SMS, data. But one of the key things that we've done is actually to integrate sustainable development goals into our business strategy. And so what we did was to sit as an organization, look at the different divisions and what we do, and then all the 17 goals, and look at which are the ones that are very close, to what we do, which are the ones that we can easily influence within our ecosystem and also outside. And so we ended up selecting 9 of those goals, ranging from education to health and to climate, which is why we are here. So as part of the B team companies, our aspiration is actually to be a net zero organization by the year 2050. And so as a first step, we've been calculating our carbon footprint for the last 6 years, just to give a feel of where we are, and also with the intention of actually having targets to reduce. So last year, for example, we reduced our carbon emissions by 1%, but despite growing our sites by about 10%. We also reduced our fuel usage by 3% to about 9 million liters of diesel. Because what happens is in Kenya, power is actually very unstable. So most of our sites would have a standby diesel generator, just in case the quality of power is not to the standard. We also measure our Scope 3 emissions, which constitute currently about 4%. We are looking at air travel and taxis, and we also have initiatives to actually reduce on that. Our target this year, for the year 2020, is actually to reduce by 50% the current standby diesel generators that we are using in our sites. And so it involves quite a number of things, changing technologies in our organization. We have to look into introducing renewable power energy, and also expansion of the national grid, which is largely actually in Kenya, it's renewable, because we have about 80% of our power from the national grid being clean, mainly from geothermal and hydropower. But the challenge is actually the distribution bit. So you find that some sections of the country would have more power than others which are in remote sites where we operate might not have that power. We've also embarked on a modernization of our equipment, our transmission equipment, which basically means we are replacing the old equipment with more modern ones, which are more power efficient. So apart from looking at ourselves internally, we also have quite a number of community initiatives. And in partnership, which is SDG 17, we work with, for example, a company called Mkopa Solar. And we have this product, which is actually GSM controlled domestic power solution, which is designed for low-income households, in rural Kenya. So what we are doing is to distribute this product. It has a GSM inside, so it's controlled by the mobile technology. It has 3 solar lighting, and so we are replacing the kerosene lamps that traditionally are used in Kenya by the use of solar. as of May 2017, we had connected about 500,000 homes, with affordable power solar. And most importantly, of course, out of that, we've actually reduced about 300,000 tons of CO2. If we are to look at it as, one bulb doing 1.3 tons of carbon every year. The payments from this solar power solution is actually done through M-Pesa, and you can actually pay on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, or on a monthly basis. We also realize that we cannot completely avoid emissions, and so one of the key initiatives that we've done is actually to grow trees specifically to offset our carbon. And so we've allocated ourselves about 1 million trees to be done in phases, probably in the next 3 years. And this one we are working in collaboration with the Kenyan government, with the communities around, to actually do reforestation of previously degraded environment. So, and this will come, of course, with a number of other benefits like rain, attracting of rain, and water conservation, among others. So I think I'll stop there for now, and we will take in any questions later.
Thank you, Michael. That's great. So our next speaker is, so Michael talked about his net zero by 2050 commitment, and Emily Hickson manages the net zero by 2050 initiative for the B team. So I'm going to ask her to talk a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to Michael and Natasha. I think I'm going to make some general points that complement some of the progress that they just demonstrated in their talks. So I'd like to make kind of 3 points in the next couple of minutes. So why business is calling for governments to set long-term strategies, why business benefits itself from setting long-term strategies, long-term goals, like the net zero goal that Safaricom has set, and why I think this aids a just transition, which is, I think, a theme of this COP. Lots of talks on just transition. So this actually goes to the heart of what the B team does. The B team is a group of 16 CEOs who came together ahead of the Paris COP to think what could they do in terms of advocacy to support the civil society call for a long-term goal in the Paris Agreement, a net zero by 2050 goal, phase-out goal. And the best thing that they thought they could do is lead by example and use that to have legitimacy to then call on governments to do the same thing. So 10 businesses set the net zero by 2050 goals across all scopes of emissions, all greenhouse gases, and then ask governments to do the same. Now, everybody here in this room knows the kind of outcome of the Paris Agreement. So we have a goal in there, but it's by kind of second half of the century. So pretty vague, not 2050, not aligned with 2 degrees or even 1.5. So why are we still calling today for governments to set long-term strategies? Because it sends a political signal that translates into an economic signal. Business needs this signal in order to invest in the technology and the innovation going forward that will allow the private sector to make this transition. These signals can also mobilize the investment that's necessary, large-scale investment. We think long-term planning, so governments who set long-term strategies and specifically outline a peaking and a kind of phase-out goal, can better identify the opportunities, the benefits that we'll get from clean air, health benefits, biodiversity benefits. And as Michael was alluding to, we think this aligns with the goals that countries are making around the SDGs. And if you set a benchmark for where you're going to phase out your emissions, that allows you to better identify your development strategies. So that's why we think that long-term strategies are paramount to national governments. We're asking that G20 governments lead the way on setting long-term strategies, and they communicate these strategies well before 2020. And they participate in the 2050 pathway platform and share their best practice. And of course, then following that, all parties should be setting these goals and communicating their peak year and their long-term goal. And then lastly, business, civil society, labour wants to participate in the writing of these strategies, and we think that's only fair. Now, why do businesses benefit? Why maybe, if I can talk on behalf of Michael, why does Safaricom set a long-term goal? For similar reasons. You need to communicate within your business that you have a long-term vision that goes beyond the tenure of the CEO, the progressive CEO that's there right now. And Michael certainly has a very progressive CEO. But your workforce needs to engage in this long-term vision. And I'll talk a minute about why that's so important for just transition. And it also lets your consumers know, it goes right to your brand. If you're in kind of entrenching this purpose that I think Natasha spoke so well to just now, in your business model, consumers respond. And there's many statistics you can draw on to show that, especially millennials of my generation want to buy from brands that are seen to have long-term purpose. Gives you big reputational benefits. So there's a business case. And then shifting to why I think that this supports a just transition. So I wanted to share with you some numbers that I'd read recently in the Asia Pacific Journal. And this is at a national level. So if we look at what the transition a country like China has to make, and you just look at the fossil fuel workers that are currently employed, who under the current NDC trajectory, the projection is that 320,000 fossil fuel workers, coal, oil and gas would lose their jobs. That's under the current NDC trajectory. If you take a 2-degree trajectory, that raises to 1.5 million. And a 1.5 trajectory, that is 2.5 million coal workers, coal, oil and gas workers rather. So long-term planning and setting a year goal and saying when these things are going to happen is incredibly important to the people that are employed in that industry today, and to the companies and to the unions that not just in China, in the US as well, there's similar patterns. Need to be able to understand the signal, need to have long-term planning. And so that's as the B team, we're trying to entrench, as these companies have set net zero goals, how can they then also integrate just transition planning into those goals? So I'll talk a little bit more about that, hopefully, in the questions.
Great, thank you, Emily. So I think that's a really good case for why net zero by 2050 is essential and why policy leadership is essential. So to move on to hear a policy perspective on long-term planning from a developing economy perspective, I'm going to ask Trini Krishnaswamy, CEO of the Vasudha Foundation, to give us a few words. Are you okay? Yeah.
Good afternoon all. From the business to the civil society initiative. This is, I'll talk about a civil society initiative in India, a unique civil society initiative in India, of working and helping in developing a short, medium, and a long-term low-carbon strategies and development pathways for India in order to ensure that India achieves a net zero emissions by the second half of the century. Now, this initiative actually is the creation of a civil society platform, which in its first year, so it was formed last year, in the first 2 years of its operation, started off by looking at the emissions profile of India, but by primarily estimating the greenhouse gas emissions for India for a period of 2005 to 2013, both at the national level as well as at the state level, accounting for carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane for all sectors, subsectors, and activities as per the IPCC format. And importantly, putting across all our findings, the emissions estimations, as well as the methodology of arriving at the emissions estimations, the raw data sets that we use to arrive at the emissions estimations in public domain by creating an exclusive web portal for this. Now, why did we start off with this initiative? And in what way is that related to helping the government in, on a short, medium, and a long-term mitigation pathway or a low-carbon strategy? Now, at that particular point of time, 2 years back when we started the work, India had just 3 inventories for 3 different points of time. So one is we did not have a historical perspective of what the emission trends in India was. and B, it was difficult while you had the overall picture, because India's inventories were as per the IPCC format of reporting. It was difficult to actually look at activity-wise emission reduction profile, especially cutting across all the sectors, whether it's the industry, whether it's the energy, whether it's the agriculture, forest, and the land use sector, or whether it's the waste sector. So what we wanted to do was to actually look at having a detailed emissions estimations with a historical trend, and that's the reason why we chose 2005 to 2013. The reason why we chose 2005 was because that's the year when the second inventory for India was prepared. So we wanted to start unpacking the government inventory and then putting it back together so that we know, or we are at least aware of how they arrived at it. Now, in addition to that, the other reason why we thought that such an exercise would be important was primarily because, as I said earlier, there was a gap or lack of data available in public domain. The inventories had the emissions profile, but it did not have as to what the data sources were and how they arrived at what were the emission factors used and so on. So one is we wanted to come up with or provide data access to people. And B, so basically looking after or taking care of the whole transparency element and making available data access. And B, also to get a sense of how various programs and activities of the government have performed. Because if you have a historical trend, we would also look at the performance of various programs in various sectors. So that was the reason, that was the second reason as to why we thought that such an exercise would be useful. Now, just to give you a sense of what the results of the results of the exercise. So basically, from 2005 to 2013, if you just to give you a sense of where we are, India's emission profile increased by about 8% over the period of these 5 years, 2005 to 2013. If you can look at the emission in 2005 was about 1,549 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and it grew to about 2,417.33 tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, the second sense where we also got is, while the national inventories or the inventories for India was at the national level, state level emissions estimation information was not available at all. So for the first time, we were able to get the state level emissions estimation, and then when we compared for a period of 2005 to 2013, you can see that in some cases in states where the emissions profiles were virtually low in 2005, increased considerably in 2013, and states that had high emissions in 2005 continue to be a high emitter in 2013. So the important lesson here, or information that we gathered here, was how the emissions profiles in states were changing over periods of time. So this is just to give you a sense as to how the states perform in terms of emissions across various sectors and activities, both in 2005 and 2013. And to cut the long story short, in terms of the actual learnings, we found that India's emissions grew for about 5.7% compounded over the period of 2005 to 2013. Energy sector was obviously the largest contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions, and it grew at 5.96% compounded annually over this period of time. The industry emissions grew by about 8.75%. The agriculture, forest, and land use sector was a net emitter at 0.53%, and the waste sector was about 3.9%. So this gives us a sense of where we are. Now, basically, the whole idea of this exercise primarily was to look at one is, it was not just this is the first level. The next step, what we are also looking at in the next years, is to come up with actual pathways for India based on these trends as to where India, what are the areas, particularly the subsectors where activities and programs can be undertaken to look at a low carbon pathway. I'll answer more questions, or I'll be able to talk more after this or in the question and answer session. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Trini. And yes, I'm sure you'll be able to get to talk more. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So moving on from the India-wide perspective, we're going to go to Professor Vinod Sharma. who is part of the Indian Institute for Public Administration, but also more relevantly, Vice Chair of the Sikkim Disaster Management Authority. Sikkim being the only state in India which has not only a net zero carbon target, but actually a carbon positive target. So, Professor Sharma.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, from Trini's presentation, this is from NGO or civil society point of view, and now I am coming to the government side, and I am trying to give a case study of a state which is a very small state in India, in the northeast, a very, very small, one of the smallest, I should say, in the country, known as Sikkim. And I think this is one of the example in the country when we talk about sustainability or carbon neutral or carbon negative, state, then I think this is one of the examples. And this has started long back. In fact, today you are in the COP23, and 23 years back, the leadership, the chief minister, because he is continuing, since last 23 years, and he was having a vision that this is small state which is having a population of 600,000 people, I think let us make it environment friendly state. And he started organic culture of the organic farming. And I am very glad to tell you that this become the first state in the country which is completely organic. Last year, Prime Minister of India, declared it, the first organic state in the country. And so this is one. Second thing is that it is in the Himalayan area. So people are living at different places, and the most critical point is water. And 4,000 springs, they dried. So there was a campaign, in last 3 years, what we did with water conservation, with the help of the Forest Department, Rural Development, and other ministries, we conserve water. And we revived all the 4,000 springs, in the region, so that water is available, in the villages. Because that is the most important part. Third thing is the energy. And the total, we have 100%, energy. We have surplus energy, in fact, in this state. And you will not believe that the state is giving, this small state is having about 12 hydro power plant, and we are giving surplus energy to the grid. Fourth thing is that we have solar energy, and now all the hotels and the houses, everywhere, we are making this almost mandatory that any new hotel or any new building which is being constructed, they should have solar heater, solar geyser, and this kind of arrangement. And though 3 months, this solar system doesn't work, but still people are encouraged and they are doing it. Another initiative is that because number of cars, this is not a very poor state. So everybody is very ambitious, and even in villages, people have cars. So what now it is mandatory that in case you want to buy a car, you will have to show that there should be a parking space. And if you don't have parking space, then you cannot purchase a car. Similarly, the transportation sector, tourism, what we have done is that it is all online. Earlier, taxis were coming from Bagdogra, because it is 130-kilometer airport from there. But nowadays, it is online, and people can register themselves, and they can come in a shared taxi, and people are encouraged, to take these shared taxis, and these shared taxi, leave you to that hotel or something. So this is very interesting thing. One very good example I want to quote here about sustainability. In 2011, we had earthquake. And after that, we had rehabilitation, reconstruction. And you will I'm very happy to tell you, because I'm the vice chair of Sikkim Disaster Management Authority, this rehabilitation or this reconstruction is unique, I should say, in the region. Because it was, in situ. Wherever house was damaged, we reconstruct house at the same place. The total, rubble we utilize in making road, because village, the most important problem is road. So the entire thing is recycled and reused, and hardly any environmental impact. So this was unique. After making house, we completed the reconstruction in 5 years. When the house is complete, we give 10 saplings, to each house owner, and of their choice, because they can have fruit trees, they can have timber trees, they can have, because any plant, you name it, and government supplied that. This is one state where in last 5 years, forest cover has increased 1.5%. So there is already 47% forest cover, which is increased to 1.5. And again, a unique thing I should say. There is one thing the last sentence is that recently the officers of Nepal, they visited Sikkim, and the Honorable Chief Minister, he advised them that you are in the Himalayan state. When you are doing reconstruction or rehabilitation, I think your central point should be environment. You should think of biodiversity, you should think of biodiversity conservation, you should think of utilizing reuse, of each and everything. And we are not saying that you adopt Sikkim model, but I think this is the best model for Himalayan state, because environment is very important for all the Himalayan states. Whenever there will be, the impact of climate change, I think these states will have to bear the burden. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. There are, n number of things, which is being done in this state, and I will be very happy to elaborate it in case there is time. Thank you.
Thank you. So to finish the panel, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Tamara Inkster-Draper, to talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing within the Corporate Leaders Group, where we've been talking to European businesses about their perspective on long-term planning overall. Tamara.
Thanks, Elliot. Switch to the next slide. So long-term planning, Amelie's set out very well why it should be important for governments and why it makes good business sense for businesses as well. What's very clear is that the decisions that we're making today for our long-term planning will affect not only where we go in the future, but also the way that we get there. So setting good, strong, long-term plans will really set the scene for how we deliver our net zero, low-carbon targets. It's clear that governments and businesses will need to work together in good collaboration to ensure that things are implemented and that our targets are achieved. We wanted to understand, so we as the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group and the European Green Growth Platform, which brings together progressive companies with progressive governments, wanted to really understand what that collaboration could look like, where we could enhance that collaboration, and how we could best work together to achieve some of the targets that are being set. So we have conducted a survey of businesses, which will help inform a number of developments on the European agenda currently. So the governance regulation proposals, which links to the national energy and climate plans, how those are achieved in the medium term, but also long term to 2050, as well as the 2018 Global Stocktake, the facilitative dialogue. The survey looked at what businesses think of long-term plans, what their own internal processes are, and how the policy environment plays into those long-term plannings, and what they'd like to see from the policy environment. To give you a little breakdown of the respondents that we've had to the survey, we had 85 companies respond. 43 of those provided a lot of detail about their internal planning and their opinions on the policy environment. 43% of those companies we could consider to be SMEs, so small medium enterprises. This is categorized as having 250 employees or less. 57% were larger companies, so 1,000 or more employees, and 30% of those companies we would consider to be large global companies. all have indicated that they have long-term plans, and the majority of respondents were made up of people from energy, infrastructure and construction, retail and consumer goods industries. And these industries said that climate regulation, energy regulation and laws would either significantly or somewhat impact their businesses. The companies responding generally had medium-term plans, so 2020, 2030, and Natasha and our colleague from Safaricom have shown that they have these plans, and Safaricom going to 2050. Not so many of the respondents had plans to 2050 at this stage, and we are seeing that companies are generally reviewing these annually or 5 years, which could either mean that they're being reviewed often, or that they're constantly being changed, so maybe some positive or negative things there. Organizational responsibility, in most cases, a large number of the percentages, the board or executive committee is the ones that are responsible for these. These are the people really holding the pen, or it's a cross-organizational effort that brings everybody along for the journey, sometimes external advisories as well, and then the board will sign off on it. And then the other figure there, just to highlight that the vast majority of companies who responded to the survey said that these long-term plans that governments are setting the policy will impact their business operations. We also asked people for their thoughts on the policy environment and their policy suggestions. In terms of what we're all here to achieve, COP23, the businesses very much want their governments to set policy and law and regulation that is in line with the Paris Agreement. The majority of businesses called for ambitious long-term policy that are consistent and stable with clear expectations, but the flexibility for them to come along and achieve these targets with them. Businesses very much called to engage with their governments to find ways that they could really work together to implement their targets and the strategies, break it down into sectoral targets, what this means for them, really ways to communicate this and work together quite strongly. And the next steps for us with this research is later on in the COP, we'll be convening a number of EU ministers with senior business leaders to really talk about the results of this survey, what it means for the policy environment at the moment and the targets that are being set, and how we can really work together to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tamara. Right, now we're getting on to the question and answer discussion bit. Now, I have a couple of quick questions that I'm going to take Chair's privilege to ask the panel. But while I do, I just want to have a plea, which is I've done a number of these side events, and quite often I find that we get to the end of the event and there's a forest of hands of people who want to get their questions in and didn't quite manage it. But usually at the point where you throw it open to the floor, it's very quiet. Nobody wants to be the first person to ask a question. So I just want to give you a bit of time to think about what question do you want to ask, because if you do want to ask a question, get it in soon, because you're much more likely to get it answered then. So a word of encouragement. Right, now before I do hand it over to the floor, so I said I had a couple of questions. So I wanted to start with our business panellists. And I suppose I'm reflecting on Emily's contribution and the conversation around the just transition. And the question I had for you was, Emily very clearly set out the importance of engaging with the labour movement, engaging with trade unions on some of these questions, on some of these long-term planning when you're talking to policymakers. But often business doesn't necessarily, the business relationship with trade unions is not necessarily as straightforward as it could be. What's your perspective as businesses about involving trade unions in these conversations? Either to Michael or to Natasha, whoever wants to go first. Both of you, in fact. Good to hear from you. Go on, Natasha. Thank you.
Okay. Good question. To be very honest, engagement with trade unions, there is some, but maybe not to a degree that Emily was pointing at. I would say our engagement is mainly with our supply chains, at least our focus for the moment when we are discussing sustainability and doing transition internally, but also trying to help externally. It's really mainly with our customers and also with our partners, so suppliers and potentially others. Now, there are some regulations which also direct us a little bit in talking to trade unions, but that goes also beyond just talking now climate. It goes also to having gender diversity in the board, equal pays, etc. So it's sustainability in a broader sense, and we do have targets and actions on these points as well.
Cool. Thank you. Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
Okay, so Safaricom is a member of the UN Global Compact, and one of the principles of the UN Global Compact is actually on labor relations, and so there are quite a number of items in there that looks at the different issues on labor. And one of the things, of course, is probably on a minimum wage, which you have to be compliant, and Safaricom is actually above in all this. We also have some of the issues that looks at the wider supply chain. For example, one of the examples that is normally given is, are we really sure as an organization that there is no child maybe selling scratch cards somewhere in the rural areas in Kenya for a living? And so, in as much as within the organization we are actually compliant with all labor issues, we are also trying to influence our ecosystem in terms of our dealers, in terms of our business partners, just to make sure that they have some of these principles also implemented in their organizations, so that we can work together in sync. So one of the things that we've done is actually through the UN Global Compact, the local network in Kenya is actually to develop some of the basic principles on labor, and we've made about now 80% of our partners in the wider supply chain to actually sign up and comply with some of them. So as one of the, so to say, big organizations in the country, we actually try influence our supply chain to also try and comply with the principles that we believe in.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be more on this. My second question was to our Indian panelists, Vinod and Trini. And it's an obvious question, again prompted by Emily's wonderful set of challenges, which is, so we talked about the G20 setting net zero by 2050 and unveiling long-term plans. And one of the things from a European perspective that's interesting about India is its willingness to, more than some other Asian countries, to set ambitious long-term goals, if you like. So I wondered if either of you had what your perspective was on the likelihood of India adopting or unveiling a long-term plan some point soon and setting a net zero target.
As of now, I think we are nowhere near. I don't see India coming up with a net zero emission target or a long-term emission reduction targets in the very near future. But thanks to some of our efforts, what the government has already done is to explore areas, is to look at a deep analysis of its various programs in the energy efficiency and the renewable energy space, and to primarily look at emission trends, emission reduction or emission trends from each of these activities. So this analysis has begun, and they have commissioned a few civil society groups and a few think tanks and others to actually look into this, to help in coming up with this analysis, and this we understand would feed in into its long-term planning. But what we think would be achievable is to to get India to come up with a little more ambitious NDC, perhaps improve on its 2020 NDC, maybe that's something that we think is could be on the cards, given that they have achieved, the government has achieved, or India has achieved a fairly fast growth in its renewable energy sector, given that given its ambitious solar targets, and they look like they're going to achieve that 100 gigawatts target set for 2022 of solar installations. And it's likely that they are likely to increase the solar targets again, or have a higher targets for the period of 2020 to 2030, which means that the share of coal in the energy mix could fall fairly drastically. So I think there is that, but then from the energy sector, while we see a lot of action, I'm not sure if that if India would really come up with a 2050 target, net zero emission target right away. It's not likely to be in the cards. That's my reading.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, I've already seen some people gesturing at me, so this is good news. So hands up if you have questions, but I'm going to start off, I think this gentleman in on the side of the row here. And if you could introduce yourself in terms of who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Russell Mills from SIF. We're a large philanthropic organization looking to support some net zero targets. I have a question for Michael. But by the way, I have a lot of family in Kenya, so I'm a big fan of Safaricom and M-Pesa. And I'm impressed by your 2050 target. My only slight concern is I may not be around to see it. So my question was, if you had more resources, either money or people or customers with long-term contracts, that kind of thing, extra to what you're already doing, would you be able to hit that 2050 target, say, by 2030? And if so, are there other barriers, technological or other barriers to overcome? Thank you.
Perhaps if we can take 2 or 3 questions before we hear responses. So, lady at the back there, and I will go for this gentleman over here next.
Hi, my name's Sandra. I'm from the University of Waterloo in Canada. My question is for Natasha. So you mentioned that one of your goals is to look at reduction in your customers' footprint. So I was wondering what mechanisms, if any, or indicators do you have in place to actually measure that progress? I also had a question in general for the panelists. How do you incorporate successful long-term strategies when the traditional business method is to look at progress and success at every financial period?
Great, very good. And the gentleman who have now, okay, yes.
John O'Brien from South Australia. 2 hats. One, I work with climate innovation across Asia and Australia, but also representing the South Australian government, who has a net zero target in 2050. So the question is in the survey tomorrow, how were the companies sourcing climate innovation? Was there any investigation into that? And clearly, sort of across the panel, there's lots of climate innovation being used. So from 3M and across all of you, how are you sourcing climate innovation to fit into to enable the long-term strategies to be delivered?
Okay, I think we can probably we should be able to collect a number of perspectives on those questions. Let's start with Natasha, if that's okay.
Sure. So to the first question, whether we have measurements in place, yes, definitely. We have the methodology developed. It is, I'm not going to explain the whole of it because it's a bit lengthy. If you're more interested, it's in the back of our sustainability report. So we do annually produce sustainability reports, and every time there's also progress measured, and the methodology is explained at the end. So it does exist, and the number 250 million has been, of course, put in place through discussion with our customers. We also developed a list of products which we consider that could contribute. We developed LCAs on each of them. Some of them are still in progress, though. So we are beefing up an LCA team to measure concretely the footprint of products. And then finally, through partnership with customers, so we also depend on their data on the emission reductions. But for example, the SF6 example that I used, there the current measurements, so with our customers G and ABB that are using our product, so in high voltage, they came to reduction to at least 98% of greenhouse gas reduction per year. And in medium voltage, it's, I think, above 80. So medium voltage is a little bit more challenging one. But of course, we are working also on the use, because in each application, the way you use the technology can also then contribute to further reductions. So again, it's case by case. We depend on customers' data, but our goals have methodology behind it, yes.
And I'll work sorry, go on. Yeah. And I'll work through the people who are named. So Michael, if you wouldn't mind going next.
Thank you. So I think specific to the question of on having a short reducing the target period for the net zero aspiration, I think one thing I must admit here is actually when we sat as a cross-functional team, including technology and people from the other organizations, one of the key concerns that we had was actually what you just said, that 2050 is actually too far, and probably it will still be there, probably will be coming in wheelchairs just to witness the achievement. So internally, we've set our target to 2030 as an organization. And one of the, after mapping out a roadmap on areas that we can easily achieve, we realize that, as I said, as a country, I think we are lucky in that most of the power that is generated in the national grid is actually green. I think about 50 to 53% now is geothermal. About more than 20% is on hydro. So what literally remains from diesel is actually from areas where, the remote sites where the national grid has not extended to. So, what we've done as an example is actually to work with the national grid organization to actually extend power. So what we do, because most of our sites, a number of our sites are actually in remote sites where the national grid has not extended to, is that we have an agreement with the national grid to actually do it from our resources, the distribution, and then out of that we can, instead of paying for power, we can actually offset, from there. So that's one of the key things, and this has come with now another quite a number of benefits, especially to the communities, because once power is in our site, then it can then be distributed also to the local communities that are living around the network. And this is on top, of course, of other solar technologies that we are introducing, wind power generation in areas where it's possible. And so with all these combinations, we believe that by 2030, it will be achievable. Okay,
I'll come to tomorrow on the question around innovation, but I want everyone on the panel to think about, I don't think we've got an answer to how we engage beyond the financial period, so it'd be good to get some answers from that.
So we didn't specifically ask our companies about where they are sourcing their innovation, but I think the responses that they gave to the policy environment questions can kind of allude to the answer. So they were very much calling for consistent policy with a clear goal at the end, which would signal their investments between now and 2050. They were clear that they wanted the flexibility in achieving these targets, so no policy lock-in, which would very much help them to finance their own innovative solutions for whatever is most sensible for their businesses and their sectors. And I think that this helps answer the questions about business models in the financial period. Looking at the companies who have answered the survey, so a lot of them were energy companies or infrastructure companies. So even though they were indicating that they had short, medium-term plans within their business models to achieve these things, the investment decisions that they're taking today go beyond those short and medium-term cycles. These are very much long-term investment decisions for energy sectors or infrastructure sectors. So having that very clear target and very clear milestones to achieve that along the way really does help companies plan their short and medium-term business models for achieving that long-term target and the long-term goals. So I think the two things are linked.
Emily.
Just on the short-termism question, I think you could write whole essays on short-termism and how. But just two things from kind of the B team perspective. So I guess the first is that we try and use our model of working with progressive CEOs to actually set a standard and kind of lead from the front on the need to kind of get over short-termism. So if I think about one of the CEOs in our group, Paul Pullman of Unilever, I think he talks a lot about sustainable growth and has kind of walked the talk on this and the need to go beyond kind of 3-month returns and think longer term about their sustainable living plan. So I think you've got CEOs talking about this. But of course, importantly, and when we've seen this personally with some of the CEOs we work with, unless you've got the board behind that as well, then you tend to struggle. So we're also doing a program on climate competency in boards. So things like the task force for financial disclosures and the CDP project, encouraging disclosure and encouraging board members to understand climate risk and that's part of their fiduciary duty. I think that's another way to tackle short-termism.
Anyone else?
What we've also looked at in terms of innovations is also to look at innovative policies, for instance. Particularly when we did the state analysis of emission reductions, what we looked at is the performance of various policies and programs. Now, just to give an example, and this was alluded to in Dr. Sharma's presentation, is that Sikkim, for example, a state, perhaps the only state and the capital of Sikkim, which is Gangtok, the only city in India has something called a parking policy. Just to elaborate on that, a parking policy basically means that you cannot, the government or the authority will not allow you to buy a car or have your car registered unless you are able to prove that you can park the car inside your house, okay, in a compound. So you can't park the car on the roadside. Now, what it has done is actually, if you looked at, when you look at a 2005 to 2013 emission trajectories in the transportation sector, there's been a, I mean, it's not a fall in the emissions in the transportation sector. It's grown, but the rate of growth is reduced considerably. From a steep growth from 2001 to 2005, the rate of growth has actually come down drastically. And in addition to that, it has had multiple other benefits like reduction in congestion. If those of you who have been in the Indian roads, you know that going from A to B can sometimes take anywhere from 10 minutes to a few hours. So, and that's so with most cities in India. So it reduces congestion, but importantly, I think it's also got a huge impact on reducing its emissions. So when we look at innovations, we look at technology innovations, we looked at market and market mechanism innovations, we looked at policies and program innovations. And so this is just one example with a whole lot of these examples that we have. And importantly, what happens is in a country like India, certain policies which are practiced in certain pockets are not necessarily known in other pockets. So the idea is to also make available this information and come up with a compendium of policies that could be implemented elsewhere in the country as well, and not just in the country, but other ways, in other developing economies as well.
Okay. Thank you. going back to the audience for questions. Before I do, I'm going to abuse my position. Just to a reflection on the business innovation question from my perspective, which is that one of the things we're talking about is getting businesses to think about, with this whole conversation, is getting businesses to think about the fact that where is their business going to be in 20, 30, 40 years' time, and what's the future for it in a net zero world, which is, I think there is a growing cohort of businesses who have got that, who are starting to think outside the box about what that means. The devil and the deep blue sea to that devil, if you like, of not thinking about the future is those businesses that are thinking about the future do have to work out how they can transform to be future-proof, how they can transform to be a sort of an innovative version of themselves that is able to exist in that future. And that actually is a challenge in terms of mobilizing the investment and going through that innovation trend. And I think that goes to what the question was about in terms of innovation. More questions? Who's got more questions? Gentleman in the front there.
Good afternoon, thank you. It is rather a comment rather than a question. In 1 minute, I thought that question on sourcing for climate innovation was a fantastic question. And if I can offer a concrete solution to what I've seen in the Nordics, in that the companies have their long-term strategy and they realize that they don't have the brains, they don't have the talent to solve all these challenges. So what they've done, some of the big corporates, is to open their spaces, their inside spaces that they have turned into incubators, and they have said to the startups, to the entrepreneurs out there, come and solve our problems. And they've developed an open innovation ecosystem within their compound, and then all these challenges are online. So in that way, they're recruiting for the talent, they're putting in the funds, and they're getting the brains from outside to come in, understanding that they don't have enough of intelligentsia inside. So in that way, they open the doors for sourcing the climate innovation, and then that allows them to move fast because the competition out there is ferocious. So this is to complement the replies that we've gotten from our esteemed panelists, that on the one side, it is good to work with the government innovation policies, and that has its own pace. On the other side, the business need to try to be future-proof, as you've said.
Thanks.
And that is more demanding. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll let you get away with a brief comment, but I prefer questions if possible. Who else has got a question? No? Yes, we'll go for that.
Hi, Dane Ratliff from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. I just wanted to pick up on your last point about fiduciary duty of directors of funds and investment funds. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about how you're seeing this translated into national law. For example, in France, you probably know about the requirement under French law to for pension fund managers to consider climate risk in their evaluation of an investment. And so if you have any other information on that and where you're seeing this translated into domestic requirements for financial managers.
Good. Any other, before I go back to the panel? Yes, lady over there. I think you can probably do this.
Hi, my name is Caroline Westblom. I work for Climate Action Network Europe, and I had a question to Tamara. If you could expand a little bit on this survey. So first of all, if it was included in the survey, what companies' impressions on the current EU legislative framework was, and if that's enough to incentivize them to put these strategies in place. And secondly, if you could expand a little bit on the key recommendations that you can take out from the conclusions of the survey. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Tamara and then any other reactions or responses people want to give.
We asked for their opinions on the current legislative framework in a very kind of roundabout way. So we asked them if they were aware of the governance package, what they thought about the current regulation and how much it impacted their business. The majority of companies were aware of the governance package and things like national energy and climate plans and frameworks. They had mixed opinions on whether it was enough for them to get on and do the thing. So sometimes, I think it was a little bit sectorally dependent as well. So some people thought that the current things in place or the current proposals were maybe a bit restrictive or didn't really, a lot of people said that the targets were quite general at this stage and didn't really give the companies a lot of understanding of how they were to work to achieve those targets. Also, there was quite a strong push for greater ambition in the targets as well. So most people thought that it didn't do enough to achieve our national and our international climate goals. In terms of the key recommendations, we had some very kind of grass is green, sky is blue recommendations that was they wanted clear, consistent, stable, set the target, tell us how to achieve that in incremental milestones so we can all come along on this journey together. But then also some very specific policy recommendations for the European Union level. So there's a lot of talk about reform of the EU ETS and how we could make that better. Energy had a lot of talk around energy as well, and the concept of energy union. So really, how do we bring the whole of Europe along on this journey?
Other responses, either on the fiduciary duty or on innovation as a practice?
No, just on the fiduciary duty question, I'm afraid I don't have a lot more information. It's not really my area of expertise, but I'm very happy to connect you to someone I know knows a lot about it. But I know that we're approaching it by trying to get a group of directors that do see climate risk and climate competency as like core necessary competencies of a board director to speak to others. So we're doing a series of convenings like that, and we're working with WEF and a series which works with a lot of investors in the States on this. So yeah, more to come.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit on the financing and also on the innovation. So from the financing point of view, for example, 3M is on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index since a couple of years. There's a lot of work that goes in there to prove that you are a sustainable company, but also once you are in, it actually profits quite a lot, the company. So there's an increasing amount of investors that are interested to look at the companies that are sustainable or responsible. So it is, I think, it's my impression, but also the practice shows that there is an increasing interest in such companies. So more and more banks are also requiring, there are some criteria on sustainability for lending. But of course, there's still a lot of discussion also on what is sustainable and green. So some work to be done there on the criteria. But going back to innovation, also I found the point of the gentleman interesting, although he left. There's a lot of discussion also. You probably heard about the design thinking. It's a new concept that more and more companies are applying. So trying to put yourself in shoes of people, be it customers or societies, to really understand what are the needs there. So innovation is really something that is not just anymore coming from we believe you need something. It's really we want to understand what do you need. So the source of innovation is also coming a lot from outside world, sharing experience with us. So there's increasingly more collaboration going on. So it's not like 3M is traditionally an innovation company. We develop, for example, 6% of our turnover into R&D. So it's we always had this in our DNA, and we believe that with our expertise, we can always work on a lot of platforms to bring out new solutions. But we don't want to do it alone anymore. We want to really work together with others, be it with civil society, be it with customers, to really understand what are the needs out there. So instead of us developing companies that we try to sell it to you afterwards, it's really we first try to understand what do you need, and then we provide a solution. So it's this switch in mind.
Cool. Anybody else who wanted to come in, or I go back to more? No, that's fine. So can I open the floor one last time for any final questions? And if not, that's fine. But your last opportunity. Yes, feel free to go ahead.
Michael Yos. My question to Tamara on your research. Of course, the biggest challenge is for energy-intensive industries. Did you take a closer look on how they handle this challenge from their perspective, what their requirements are? Thank you.
Go on.
Very briefly, not in that level of detail, unfortunately. I think the fact that they are one of the largest sectors to respond, and the majority of respondees come from energy sectors, I think shows that it is a big issue for them. They are engaged in this issue. They do want to engage with their governments and really help to drive solutions that work for them as well as nationally and internationally, but not to the detail that you are asking, I'm sorry.
Anyone else who wants to come in? Okay. Thank you very much for listening to us. I'm gonna go down the panel again just to get some concluding remarks, if brief concluding remarks, if anybody has any reflections on the conversation. From my point of view, I think it's been a really good conversation, and I think you've heard this diversity of perspectives that show the value of long-term planning, both from business and from governments, and the challenges in terms of developing it, including, you know, whether it's how you solve the innovation problem to building boards' capacity to think in a different way. Can I, because I've been up and I've been down, so I'm going to say, can we start in the middle, just to be something different? Trini, would you like to give me any kind of final thoughts that you have on this conversation and where you want to go next with it? And then we'll go up and then finish with Tamara and Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, some of the unique, interesting observations that we've looked at is that sometimes it's not necessarily that one requires policy to drive innovation. Sometimes it's the other way around. We have, for example, we've seen interesting cases of how solar thermal applications in certain pockets of India have actually done very, very well, thanks to business innovations and market innovations and pricing and cost innovations. Much before the city or the province had even a policy on making it mandatory for solar thermal applications in certain areas. So I think what I believe is that you require a multitude of efforts, both from the business side as well as the civil society, to monitor some of these actions, as well as from the government side, and not just wait for government policies to drive things. Very often, like I said, this and let me in half a minute sort of elaborate on this. This is a city down south of India called Bangalore, where there was no policies. This was about 2005, 7, 8. In that period of time, there was no policies on making solar water heaters mandatory for all households. Now, of course, post 2010, it's mandatory for all households of certain threshold levels to have solar water heaters installed on rooftops. But well before that, even before this law came, was operational, almost every house in Bangalore actually had that, largely because of innovative market strategies that solar thermal companies actually adopted to push for this. So even in large apartment buildings, right, where the rooftop space was small and the ownership was divided amongst large number of households, companies came up with innovative models to ensure that solar water installations were supplying hot water to every household, and at very affordable price. So I think these kind of innovations are important, but and you also have, on the other hand, the Sikkim example, where the government has taken certain initiatives in actually driving down demand for vehicles, private vehicles. So I think you need a combination of these innovative policies and drives.
Yeah, definitely tend to agree with you, Trini. I think actually that's really well exampled in the diagram that Tamara had on her slide of the virtuous circle, where you have kind of like businesses trying to lead the way, which then like allows space for governments to like set new policy, which then inspires new businesses. It's what we try, and I guess what our theory of change is in a lot of business NGOs in this space. That's what we hope to unlock. So yeah, that's a takeaway of mine as well. I think, you know, to the question of what the kind of long-term goal year, net zero year will be in some countries' long-term strategies. I mean, obviously, what we're calling for in 2050 is fairly ambitious, but we wouldn't be calling for it if we thought it was already going to happen. So yeah, I completely understand what you were saying there, Trini. And I guess I've learned a lot about Sikkim State, which I didn't know a lot about before. And your initiative around parking spaces, I've never heard that before. So yeah, it's been very enjoyable.
Michael.
Okay. Actually, 2 points, you know. One is on long-term strategy. I think 2 things are important. One is the policy. So now in India, every state is having a state plan for climate change. Almost every state, you know. And we have action plan, yearly plan, then 5-year plan. So what we do in Sikkim, that we revise it, you know, almost every year. The second thing is that the political will, I think that is very important. And in case you want to go for, you know, short-term or long-term strategy in meeting this kind of target, political will is very, very important, and which is very much there. In case you want to implement things, then in India we have 3 tiers governance. One is the central government, and second is the state government, and then the Panchayati Raj. So Panchayati Raj is the lowermost tier. In Sikkim, you will be surprised to note that this 3rd tier is very strong. And in case you sensitize them, in case you tell them that what is required for the state, the things are very easy. And the Honorable Chief Minister, he used this policy, you know, bottom up. Instead of, you know, just posing things that you will have to do this way, he involved the lowermost functionary, the lowermost, you know, this Panchayati Raj, and trained these people basically, and told them that environment is most critical, you know, in Himalayan states. And that's how he was successful, that in 20 years' time, the complete state become organic. Second point is in innovation. In fact, we inbuilt innovation, you know, in development. For example, in earthquake reconstruction, the local traditional wisdom, which was almost dying, you know, we were having this Accra type of houses. Accra type of houses, bamboo house basically, and on both sides there are mud. So that was, people have forgotten that, and everybody wants a pakka house, you know, bricks and cement and all these things. Now, he gave, you know, this project to some of the architects, and they came out with a solution that in case, instead of 1 layer, in case we have 2 layers, instead of mud, in case we have cement, then it is more stronger, it is, the insulation is more, and acceptable to the people. So I think this is one. Second thing is that in Himalayan area, you might be knowing, in India, I think we are having several thousand glacial lakes. In Sikkim, we have 600 odd glacial lakes in the Sikkim. And all glacial lakes are increasing. And one of the glacial lake, it increased 16 times actually. So we were having all this scientific data, and then we invite one person, you know, when we are talking innovation, I think this is the best example of innovation we did in the state. And Mr. Sonam Wangchu, you know, he came from Ladakh, and he gave a solution that why not, you know, we can siphon this water to the river, and ultimately the volume will decrease. And then the danger of glove will go. I think this is the first, it was very expensive experiment, and it is not easy actually that 18,000 feet, you know, you take pipes and all these things. but we did it.
Dr. Sharma, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there just so we've got time for our...
No, it's just finished.
Okay, perfect.
So,
didn't have to cut you off, that's good.
So we could siphon, this water, and now it is about 1/6 of the total volume, so we could avoid GLOF. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Michael, do you want to go next?
Thank you. So I think for me, one of the key takeaways is actually for these long-term strategies as well, we need to set some key milestones so that we don't actually tackle the whole problem, immediately. You would rather break it down into pieces, into things that technology and resources that are available at any one time can actually be able to solve. So I think having milestones on what we want to achieve at any given time is good, or achieving the whole aspiration. The other one, and related to that, is actually for climate. We are now doing science-based targets so that we look at what we are doing as an industry in relation to others, and what exactly and how much do we need to actually reduce, so that we achieve our aspiration. The other thing is benchmarking. And it's critical, especially in the countries where we come from, just not to look at what is going on in your country, but also what is being done, elsewhere in globally, so that even as you come up with different strategies and solutions, you actually benchmark with others beyond your borders. And finally, I know a lot has been talked about on innovation. I think technology and innovation has a huge opportunity in terms of solving some of these problems. And for Safaricom, we have several examples as well. And using our money transfer service, we've been able to actually expand what used to be, a simple solution of transferring money to now having different solutions for payments, to having insurance for different products, to even working with the World Food Program to distribute, which previously were distributing food physically, using trucks for thousands of kilometers, to now sending money, registering refugees, sending money to them, and then they can use the same money to actually purchase, food on their own. So there's a lot that technology can do to actually overcome some of the different problems that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, I would like to build on what Emily said. I think it's no secret then that companies, we do follow the regulations. Of course, our sustainability goals are based on societal challenges, but also we look at the mega trends from a political perspective. My plea here would be really that when politicians decide to move into a low-carbon world, that they set really clear goals, clear strategies as well. So goals have to be supported by good regulatory frameworks, and that they stick to it. The worst that can happen is that today they tell us you need to move in the investing in renewables, in electromobility if you want. We put all the innovation and investments there, and then in 5 years they tell us we decided to do something else, as happened, for example, with the solar industry in Europe a few years ago. So my plea would be really that governments also have to stick to the long-term goals, and technologies will be there, that's for sure.
Tamara?
Thanks, Elliot. I guess my main takeaway is from the work that we've been doing, but also listening to the examples that my fellow panelists have provided, is I feel encouraged. I think that governments and companies are thinking long-term, they are thinking about future-proofing, they are thinking about how we can work together to create better environments for ourselves in the future. Speed is crucial, obviously, and bringing everyone along is going to be key, but I think that in collaboration, we are stronger, and I hope more nimble, and we can start to really unlock that low-carbon transition for a better future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you, the audience. Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. And I hereby draw this event to a close. Thank you.